They told you to kill your ego, that the ego is the enemy. That enlightenment means becoming egoless. But what if that's completely backwards? What if your ego isn't a flaw? It's a function. Carl Jung didn't just disagree with this modern spiritual cliché. He dismantled it. In Aion, Jung makes a bold claim. You don't need to dissolve your ego. You need to understand it, integrate it, and evolve it. Because without an ego, you don't grow, you disappear. And here's the kicker. The very tool you've been told to destroy might be the only one capable of leading you to wholeness. The ego isn't your prison, it's your compass. It helps you navigate the chaos of the unconscious, confront your shadow, and walk the razor's edge between illusion and self-realization. When misunderstood, the ego inflates or collapses. But when honored, it becomes a bridge between who you are now and who you're meant to become. In this video, we'll unravel why Jung believed the ego was essential, not just for mental stability, but for spiritual growth. We'll dive into how it connects with the persona, dances with the shadow, and responds to the mythic pull of the collective unconscious. By the end, you won't just understand your ego, you'll befriend it. And that might be the most rebellious thing you can do in a world that keeps telling you to let it die. Chapter 1. Understanding Jung's concept of the self and ego. When Carl Jung dived deep into researches into the phenomenology of the self, he cracked open something few ever dare to touch: the distinction between who we think we are and who we really are. The ego, that busy little voice narrating your life, is just the tip of the iceberg. Most people cling to it like it's the captain of the ship, when in reality, it's more like a loud passenger, believing it's in control, yet unaware of the vast unconscious currents beneath. Jung teaches that the self is the whole psyche, both conscious and unconscious, and unless we're willing to look below the surface, we'll stay trapped in a very shallow sense of identity. Think about it. How often do we confuse ourselves with our thoughts, our job titles, or our social roles? That's the ego talking. But the self, in Jungian terms, is far more mysterious and powerful. It's the totality of who we are, including our deepest dreams, repressed fears, archetypal patterns, and ancient psychic energy that pulses beneath our awareness. It's like comparing a flashlight to the sun. Useful, sure, but nowhere near the whole picture. And when someone only operates from the ego, they're just scratching the surface of their potential. Take, for instance, the difference between reacting and reflecting. When someone cuts you off in traffic and you explode with rage, that's the ego defending its fragile sense of control. But when you pause, breathe, and ask, why did that hit me so hard? You're beginning to touch the self. That's where real personal development begins. Not in controlling the outer world, but in uncovering what's steering you from within. Jung wasn't suggesting we destroy the ego. He was showing us it's not the whole story. And oh, how many stories remain unread within us? Many people today are waking up to this idea, especially through practices like shadow work, meditation, and active imagination. These aren't trendy spiritual buzzwords. They're tools to dialogue with the unconscious to see what the ego cannot. If you're looking for somewhere to start, Jung's The Red Book is a terrifying and beautiful map into that realm. But so is journaling every morning or paying attention to recurring symbols in your dreams. These small acts are doorways into the vast mansion of the self, where the ego is just one room among many. So when you find yourself asking, who am I really? You're not being dramatic. You're standing at the threshold of Jung's deepest insight. The journey from ego to self is the path of real spiritual growth, identity expansion, and consciousness. But to even take that first step, you'll need to understand how the ego operates, and more importantly, how little it knows about what's truly driving you. And that's exactly where we'll go next. Chapter 2. The Ego's Role in Consciousness. The ego, as Jung describes, is like the lighthouse keeper of our psyche, perched high, scanning the surface, yet unaware of the vast ocean below. It organizes our conscious thoughts, mediates our identity, and allows us to say, "I am," but it's far from being the commander-in-chief. According to Carl Jung, the ego is just the center of consciousness, not the whole personality. The real powerhouse lies in the unconscious, silently shaping emotions, choices, and desires that often feel like free will but aren't fully under our control. Think about a moment when you acted completely out of character, maybe snapping at someone or making a reckless decision, and later you asked yourself, "What got into me?" That's the unconscious speaking through a crack in the ego's polished mask. We like to believe we're in charge, that our thoughts and behaviors are carefully curated. But Jung reminds us, the ego is limited, shaped by external conditioning and internal fears, blind to the deeper self that's constantly influencing it. Consciousness, then, is less like a spotlight and more like a candle in a vast, shadowed room. Understanding this limited scope of the ego is crucial for personal development. When someone identifies too strongly with their ego, they begin to resist change, avoid discomfort, and ignore signs from the unconscious. That's where shadow work becomes a necessary companion, offering a way to look inward and dismantle the illusion of control. Journaling, dream analysis, and therapeutic introspection are simple yet powerful ways to start this dialogue. Because let's face it, if your ego is the only voice you're listening to, you're missing the real counsel. But this isn't about demonizing the ego. Jung didn't want us to eliminate it. He wanted us to reposition it. The ego plays a vital role. It helps us make decisions, relate socially, and build coherent narratives about our lives. The problem is when it starts believing it's the self. That's like a tour guide forgetting they're not the museum. You need the ego, but you also need to recognize when it's standing in the way of deeper truths. And the unconscious has no shortage of creative ways to make itself known when ignored, often through projection, conflict, or even illness. So, the next time you catch yourself overly defending your opinions, obsessing over how you're perceived, or avoiding honest self-reflection, pause. That's your ego, holding the wheel a bit too tight. And if you dare to loosen its grip, to question what's beneath the surface, you might just discover how the unconscious is gently trying to nudge you towards something bigger than certainty. Something timeless, universal, and mysterious, waiting just beneath the skin of what we call free will. Chapter 3. Free will versus determinism. Free will. The sacred cow of modern identity. We love to believe we're in charge, don't we? That every decision, every success or failure is ours alone. But Jung throws a wrench into this comforting narrative. In his view, what we call free will is often the ego mistaking unconscious impulses for conscious choice. Behind every "I decided to," there's a personal unconscious and a collective unconscious quietly scripting scenes, planting mythic symbols, and directing psychic energy where it sees fit, often without our permission or awareness. Let's say you've always chosen partners who end up abandoning you. At first glance, that looks like bad luck. But peel the layers, and you'll find archetypes, perhaps the orphan, the wounded child, or the trickster, lurking in the collective unconscious, reenacting a script that's older than your name. Jung believed these patterns weren't coincidences. They were psychological blueprints passed down through generations. And the ego? It just walks onto the stage thinking it's improv, unaware the lines were written long before the curtain rose. This doesn't mean we're puppets, helpless in the face of fate. Far from it. What Jung offers is a middle path. Yes, unconscious forces are real and powerful, but through self-awareness, we can begin to co-author the story. That's where free will emerges, not from denial of determinism, but from our willingness to see what's really shaping our choices. Meditation, active imagination, and honest shadow work are like flashlights in a cave. You don't control the cave's layout, but you can choose how far you're willing to explore it. One practical way to explore this balance is by tracking patterns in your emotional responses. Start a reaction journal. Each time something triggers a strong response, anger, fear, desire, write it down. Then ask, what archetype could be at play here? Is this really my choice, or a rerun of an unconscious program? You'll be amazed how often what feels like a decision is just the ego following an old groove carved by psychic energy and mythic symbols embedded deep in the psyche. So, while we may never have absolute control, we do have something better: the ability to participate consciously in our own becoming, to take the hand of the unconscious rather than letting it shove us from behind. And that's where things start to get interesting, because once you realize how much of your identity isn't actually yours, you begin to glimpse the vast terrain of the true self, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 4. The Unconscious and Its Influence. The unconscious isn't some dusty archive locked away in your mind. It's a living, breathing force that shapes every decision, every reaction, and every dream. Carl Jung taught that the unconscious is split into two key parts: the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. While the ego struts around believing it's calling the shots, the unconscious quietly feeds it thoughts, emotions, and impulses like a backstage director. If you've ever said, "I don't know why I did that," you've had a brush with this invisible power. The self, as Jung defines it, can never be fully known without diving into these deeper layers. And until you do, you're operating on partial power, like trying to sail with half a mast. The personal unconscious holds your forgotten memories, repressed emotions, and unresolved traumas. It's like a vault of psychic energy built from everything you've experienced but couldn't process. Ever had a sudden wave of anxiety in a familiar situation? That's likely your personal unconscious pulling on old strings. Jung believed that ignoring these cues was dangerous. They don't disappear. They simply erupt in other forms. That passive-aggressive text you sent, that repeated relationship pattern, often those are echoes from this hidden realm. Facing them requires courage, but also grants immense freedom, because what remains unconscious will continue to run your life, and you'll keep calling it fate. Then there's the collective unconscious, a deeper, more mysterious layer that connects all of us. It holds archetypes, universal mythic symbols like the hero, the mother, the trickster, that influence how we interpret the world. These symbols aren't learned, they're inherited. You might dream of a snake or a cave without ever having read Jung, but those images still hold meaning rooted in our shared human experience. They're ancient templates the psyche uses to make sense of the unknown. Jung argued that understanding these symbols isn't just interesting. It's essential for spiritual growth and identity formation. They show up in dreams, myths, films, and even our day-to-day dramas. To interact with the unconscious, start simply. Keep a dream journal. Pay attention to recurring themes, people, or places in your dreams. Notice what emotions surface during your day that feel irrational or disproportionate. These are doorways into deeper truths. Reading Man and his symbols or exploring active imagination exercises can help decode what your unconscious is trying to reveal. It's like learning a new language, a symbolic, intuitive one that bypasses logic and speaks directly to the self. And once you start decoding it, everything changes. You begin to realize your life isn't just happening to you. It's being co-authored by a part of you that's been hidden all along. So when you feel pulled towards something you don't understand, an image, a person, a story, pause. Ask yourself what's really at play. Because the unconscious doesn't knock politely. It moves through dreams, slips of the tongue, strong emotions, and unexpected moments. And what it reveals might just unravel the very idea of who you think you are. Chapter 5. The persona and its relationship to the ego. The persona is like a well-tailored suit we wear to function in society. Carl Jung described it as the mask we put on to navigate the outside world, an identity shaped by expectations, roles, and norms. It allows the ego to interact with others smoothly, but here's the catch. Many people confuse the persona with the self. They begin to believe the performance is who they truly are. That's when things get messy. The persona, if left unchecked, becomes a prison, and the longer you stay in character, the harder it is to remember who you were before the show began. Imagine a doctor who never steps out of the healer role, even with friends and family. Or a corporate executive who forgets how to play, relax, or cry. These aren't rare cases. They're everyday examples of people trapped by their persona. The ego, in its attempt to maintain control and gain approval, fuses with this mask. The result? A slow erosion of authenticity. Jung warned that the more you identify with your persona, the more the unconscious will rebel through depression, anxiety, or sudden identity crises. The self longs to be whole, and a life lived only on the surface can't sustain that longing. Shadow work becomes essential here, because behind every polished persona is a shadow full of denied desires, forgotten passions, and repressed truths. If your persona is the diplomat, your shadow might be the warrior. If you're always agreeable, your shadow may contain rage. Recognizing this duality doesn't mean throwing off the persona. It means understanding it's just one layer. Try this. Write down the roles you play daily. Then ask, what am I hiding to keep these roles intact? That question alone can crack open long-buried parts of your psyche and invite real integration. The goal isn't to kill the persona, it's to make it transparent. When the ego uses the persona consciously, it becomes a tool rather than a disguise. You can switch roles without losing yourself. You can navigate society while staying anchored in your deeper truth. Jung believed that spiritual growth involves knowing when you're acting and why. It's the difference between a performer who knows they're on stage and one who's forgotten they're in costume. And that awareness, rooted in self-awareness and honesty, is where personal development begins to flourish. So, if you're feeling stuck, anxious, or fake, it might not be your life that's a problem. It might be the mask. And once you start peeling it back, layer by layer, you begin to hear the whispers of something deeper. Something older than the persona. Something buried, maybe but never gone. Chapter 6. Integration and Shadow Work. Shadow work isn't about fixing yourself. It's about meeting the parts of you that have been exiled. Carl Jung described the shadow as the unconscious container of everything we deny, reject, or fear within ourselves. It holds the traits we call bad, but also suppressed talents, desires, and truths we've buried to fit into the world. Integration is the process of bringing those parts back into conscious awareness, not to indulge them, but to understand them. And that's where real self-awareness begins, not in polishing your image, but in looking into your darkness without flinching. Because what you avoid owns you. Imagine you're constantly people-pleasing. Everyone thinks you're kind, easygoing, dependable. But inside, you're exhausted, resentful, boiling. That's a classic sign your shadow is crying out to be seen. Beneath that agreeable persona might be suppressed anger, unmet needs, or a fierce inner warrior longing for voice. Jung insisted that if you don't do this work consciously, it will burst out unconsciously, often in destructive ways. So yes, shadow work is uncomfortable. but it's also a gateway to freedom. You stop reacting and start responding from a place of wholeness. Start small. Keep a journal of moments when your emotions spike. Envy, rage, shame, pride. These are invitations from your shadow. Ask, what part of me is being triggered here? What am I trying to hide? Books like Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert A. Johnson or Meeting the Shadow edited by Connie Zweig are great companions on this path. And don't be afraid to talk to a therapist or mentor who understands depth psychology. The unconscious is not a place you want to explore entirely alone. It's filled with illusions, projections, and trickster energy that can easily derail the ego. Integration doesn't mean becoming perfect. It means becoming real. When you bring your shadow into the light, you reclaim psychic energy that was previously bound in suppression. You start to feel more whole, more grounded, more alive. That doesn't mean acting out every impulse, but rather understanding them, dialoguing with them. The parts of yourself you once hated become teachers. The inner critic becomes a guide. Even your shame can become a compass pointing to deeper healing. This is the terrain of spiritual growth, not love and light, but raw honesty and compassion. And here's the paradox. The more you face your shadow, the more love you're able to give and receive. Why? Because you're no longer projecting your darkness onto others. You see them more clearly. You hold space for their flaws because you've faced your own. And just when you think the journey couldn't go any deeper, you stumble upon something unexpected in the unconscious, a new insight that flips everything you thought you knew about your psyche. Chapter 7. Jung's critique of Freud's model of the unconscious. Carl Jung deeply respected Freud, but he didn't hesitate to challenge him where it mattered most: the nature of the unconscious. Freud saw the unconscious primarily as a vault of repressed desires, mostly sexual and aggressive instincts. In Freud's world, the ego was constantly under siege by forbidden urges that had to be suppressed for the sake of civilization. Jung, however, believed this view was far too narrow. Yes, the unconscious contains repressed material, but it also holds the seeds of creativity, wisdom, and transformation. It's not just a basement, it's also a cathedral. Jung argued that Freud's model ignored the spiritual and symbolic dimensions of the psyche. Reducing everything to libido, in Jung's eyes, was like trying to explain a symphony using only one note. He introduced the idea of the collective unconscious, those mythic symbols, archetypes, and patterns that connect all human beings. These weren't personal neuroses. They were ancient blueprints of consciousness. To Jung, the unconscious wasn't just a place of pathology. It was a source of renewal, purpose, and psychic energy. And that distinction would shape an entirely new path in depth psychology. Take dreams, for example. Freud would interpret them as wish fulfillment rooted in sexual repression. Jung saw them as messages from the self, encoded in archetypal imagery. A dream of drowning, for Freud, might symbolize suppressed desire. For Jung, it could signal a call to surrender ego control and descend into the unconscious to integrate a lost part of the self. This shift in interpretation is enormous. It means your dreams aren't betraying you, they're guiding you, and they deserve more reverence than analysis driven by old trauma scripts alone. If you've ever explored dream work and found Freud's lens lacking, you're not alone. Jung's approach opens new doors. Try recording your dreams and asking what archetype is appearing. Is it the shadow, the animus, the wise old man? Let those symbols speak to your current spiritual growth or emotional dilemmas. Books like Dreams by Jung himself or Inner Work by Robert Johnson can help translate these images beyond mere repressed impulses. They invite you into dialogue with your deeper self, not just your inner wounds. So while Freud gave us the shovel to dig into the unconscious, Jung gave us the compass. And once you realize the unconscious isn't just filled with darkness, but also with light, a new question begins to form. What exactly are these archetypes that live inside all of us? And how are they shaping the stories we live every day? Chapter 8. The Role of Archetypes and Symbols in the Collective Unconscious. Archetypes are the skeleton keys of the psyche. Ancient, universal patterns that unlock hidden truths within the self. Carl Jung discovered that throughout history, across every culture, humans have told the same stories using different faces. The hero's journey, the nurturing mother, the wise old man, the shadow. All of these are archetypes embedded in the collective unconscious. They're not inherited biologically, but psychically. And whether you realize it or not, they're running silently beneath your daily life, surfacing in dreams, art, movies, and relationships. Think about how drawn we are to mythic stories. Luke Skywalker battling Darth Vader, Neo awakening in the Matrix, or Simba reclaiming his throne. These aren't just good scripts. They resonate because they reflect the archetypal dance unfolding in every human psyche. When you dream of being chased, of flying, or of meeting a mysterious figure in a forest, you're not just processing stress. You're receiving a message from the collective unconscious. Symbols, like dreams, bypass the rational mind and speak directly to the soul. And ignoring them would be like ignoring a map while lost in the woods. Archetypes help shape not only our narratives, but our identities. You might unconsciously play out the martyr, the rebel, the caregiver, or the magician, without realizing it's part of a larger mythic pattern. Jung believed that by recognizing these archetypes, you can begin to work with the unconscious, not against it. Want a practical way to explore them? Dive into The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell, or watch how the same archetypes show up in your favorite Netflix series. The stories that move you most are probably mirroring parts of your own inner landscape. Symbols are how the unconscious speaks. A lion might mean power. A cave might mean rebirth. A broken mirror could symbolize fractured identity. Learning this symbolic language doesn't require mystical talent, just attention. Keep a journal of powerful images or metaphors that show up in your dreams or life. Ask what they might be saying, not just literally, but symbolically. These symbols carry psychic energy and can point toward parts of the self you haven't yet integrated. Jung called this the path of individuation, the sacred unfolding of who you were always meant to be. And here's the kicker. The more consciously you engage with these archetypes, the more agency you gain over your personal development. You're no longer at the mercy of invisible scripts. You're a co-creator in your own myth. And just when you think you've mapped the whole terrain, Jung reminds us there's another layer. How these archetypes live differently in each person, depending on whether they rise from personal experience or from something even deeper. Chapter 9. Personal and Collective Unconscious. Understanding the difference between the personal and collective unconscious is like realizing there are two different rivers flowing beneath your thoughts, one from your personal past and one from humanity's ancient memory. Carl Jung made this distinction to help us better navigate our inner world. The personal unconscious is formed by your unique life experiences, forgotten memories, traumas, dreams, and suppressed emotions. The collective unconscious, on the other hand, is a deeper, inherited layer filled with archetypes and mythic symbols that connect you to every human who's ever lived. And yes, both influence you constantly, even when you think you're being purely rational. Let's say you have a fear of abandonment. That might stem from childhood wounds, something stored in your personal unconscious. But if you dream of being lost in a forest or left behind during a flood, you're now stepping into the symbolic language of the collective unconscious. Jung believed these dreams weren't just personal. They were messages from a shared psychic reservoir. They point to universal themes of separation, transformation, and rebirth. And if you learn how to interpret them, you unlock profound insights, not only into your personal development, but into the very structure of consciousness itself. When people ignore these unconscious layers, they often feel disconnected or fragmented. You might follow every self-help trend, journal religiously, and still feel like something's missing. That missing piece is usually the soul's longing to reconnect with the mythic, what Jung called the self, the wholeness that emerges when ego, personal unconscious, and collective unconscious begin to harmonize. This process isn't abstract. It can show up in therapy, in meaningful synchronicities, or in art that stirs something ancient inside you. That's the language of the unconscious knocking. If you want to begin bridging these layers, start by exploring recurring patterns in your life. What roles do you always fall into? What stories seem to repeat? Then, turn to mythology or Jungian psychology to see how your personal narrative fits into a larger archetypal pattern. For example, maybe you're living out the wounded healer or the reluctant hero. Books like The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, or Clarissa Pinkola, Stace Women Who Run with the Wolves, are great places to begin this inner excavation. The more symbolic connections you make, the more your personal wounds begin to make sense in a broader, timeless context. And once you've glimpsed how the personal and collective unconscious shape your identity, you'll never look at yourself the same way again. Because the truth is, you're not just an isolated self. You're a living thread in the vast tapestry of human experience. And now that we've laid that foundation, we can finally turn to what Jung believed was the core of this intricate journey, the dynamic tension between ego and self, and why the ego, in spite of its flaws, is absolutely necessary. Conclusion: which role are you playing that no longer feels real? So now that you know your ego isn't the villain but the guide, what will you do with it? Will you keep wearing masks and calling it authenticity? Will you keep blaming your patterns on fate, ignoring the shadow knocking at your door? Or will you begin the work, real, raw, transformational work, of integrating all parts of yourself? Because the truth is, your ego isn't here to be destroyed. It's here to grow, evolve, and carry the torch into the unknown. But only if you're brave enough to take the first step inward. Ask yourself, which role am I playing that no longer feels real? What part of me have I hidden for the sake of being accepted? What symbols, dreams, and archetypes have been guiding me all along? Unseen, unacknowledged? Your unconscious holds answers you've been craving, and your ego is the one who must turn the key. No one can walk this path for you, and no algorithm, no affirmation, no guru will do the shadow work your soul came here to do. The question is, will you? If this resonated with something deep inside you, don't let it fade. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to keep diving into these teachings with me. There's so much more to uncover about the self, the unconscious, and the cosmic mystery of who we really are. Leave a comment below. Tell me how this challenged you, inspired you, or shook something loose. This isn't just a conversation. It's a revolution of awareness. And we're only getting started.